We're going to get started. Our speakers are Jack Hughes of Liebert, Cassidy, and Whitmore as an associate attorney since 1996 with Liebert, Cassidy, and Whitmore. Since then, he's worked on in all aspects of the firm's labor and employment law practice. Jack's been involved in public sector employment law trial and appellate court litigation on behalf of several California cities. He's served as a labor negotiator for city, county, and special district clients and has represented charter cities in labor negotiation, impasse, interest arbitration proceedings, something that we don't know anything about here in the city of Vallejo. Jack specializes in training on protected status discrimination, harassment, retaliation, supervisor skills, labor relations negotiations, leave law, disability law, workplace violence, free speech, disciplinary procedures, grievance procedures, and effective performance evaluations, among others. I don't know, what don't you do, Jack? Mike Oliver has 30 years of public agency management and private sector experience. He's served in this as a city manager of the cities of Oakley, Citrus Heights, and San Leandro, with over 20 years of public management experience. He's also provided consulting services to local governments, private sector clients, and landowners seeking development and entitlement improvements for residential and commercial projects. Bill McCammon, thank you. Bill McCammon. Bill has over 30 years of experience in the fire service and serving over 14 years as a fire chief. Bill retired from the Alameda County Department and now serves as the contract executive director for the East Bay Regional Communications System Authority, a joint powers authority with 35 member agencies serving Alameda and Contra Costa counties. With that, I'm going to turn it over to Jack.
All right. Well, good evening. How's everybody doing? Thrilled to be here. Well, I'm an attorney, and I'm here to help. See how well that goes over? Okay, no hurling objects this time. Very good. My purpose of being here this evening is to provide as much objective information as I can about the employment law side of the issue of regionalizing public services. There's many different ways public agencies can consider, and if they choose to do so, they actually implement a regionalization of public service. The role that our law firm plays is we're there to help facilitate that process if and when the decision has been made to do so. In our firm, we specialize in representing just local public agencies here in the state of California. We've been at it for 30 years. And we've got a pretty good roster of clients that gives us an opportunity to have a fairly good 30,000-foot view of what's going on out there in the world, to see what works, what doesn't, how a process can work, how it may not work so good. And based upon that, we can offer you some thoughts this evening. Last year alone, we represented about 55% of the cities in this state in active matters. We had matters from 50 to 58 counties and represented a wide variety of special districts. So we have a pretty good view of what's going on out there in the world. I'm not here this evening as an advocate for anything. Okay? I'm not here for a political purpose. My intention this evening is purely educational, to provide you what I see as the issues that are inherent in the discussion about regionalization from an employment law perspective, and address whatever questions you may have to the best of my ability. We've prepared a little handout for you that is made available. If you don't happen to have them, we'll get one for you before the evening is out. That kind of overviews some of the legal questions that were raised, and one is pondering during regionalization. My particular role in this process is usually, I am the guy in the room who's working with the parties to try to hammer out from an employment law perspective, how is this actually going to work? I'm the person that helps negotiate the labor agreement that empowers a regionalization process to occur. And there is a blizzard of different issues that can come up. These are issues that if an agency is considering regionalizing, they need to be thinking about, they need to be planning for, they need to have done their homework on, and they need to be prepared to discuss with their employees before they take the ultimate step to move a workforce from one agency to another, to create a joint powers authority, or to otherwise engage in any kind of regionalization tool that they may choose to use. I've negotiated in a number of places where we have done some regionalization. Sometimes it's creation of a joint powers authority. Sometimes it's handing a function from a city or town over to a county. In other places, it's disbanding a workforce at the local level and handing it over to a state organization. So there's lots of different ways to do it. Whether a particular mechanism works in a particular place, that's left to the policymakers of that particular place. That's why we have representative democracy. But once that decision's been made, among the issues we need to be prepared to discuss are things such as, what's the fate of the workforce? Are the current employees providing this service going to be absorbed by another agency? If so, under what conditions? Are they going to go with all the wages, the benefits, the medical, the retirement, the vacation, the sick leave that they had when they worked for Organization A as they go over to Organization B? What's the timing of this event? What's the fate of things that are important to people on an emotional level when an organization is wrapped up? You'd be amazed how long one can spend with employees negotiating over issues such as what happens to the patch on your shoulder? What happens to the badge that you no longer need? Who pays for the uniform that you need at this new place you're going to go work for? And what happens with your retiree medical benefits? These are among the issues that we look to. Now, if you have particular questions about specific types of issues that may need to be negotiated, candidly, I've got a whole list in front of me of different sorts of things I've thought of that may be bargainable, but I don't want to bore you with 3 hours of laborious discussion about that. But I think we can address whatever questions you may have about those issues when we get into the Q&A portion of this evening. But so as to not totally hog the microphone, let me kick it over to Bill and let him offer some thoughts. Mike's up next.
I didn't have such a short speech. I'm in trouble here. I can pare mine down. I'm Mike Oliver, and it's a pleasure to be here this evening. I'm president of a consulting firm called Municipal Resource Group that was formed a couple of years ago by a number of professionals and who had many years of public sector experience and also consulting experience. I'm here this evening. I don't work for the city of Vallejo. I'm independent of that. Bill is a member of the firm, and we don't have any interest currently in any activity that either of us are participating in the city. But we do make a number of presentations during the year to League of California Cities, to the LAFCO statewide organization about local government activities, and particularly I talk a lot about finance. So what I'd like to do is just take a few minutes to give you a little bit of a 30,000-foot view of local government finance. And the reason for that is that currently the state of California and local governments, cities and counties are facing an unprecedented financial situation. Excuse me, I cut my teeth in 1978 in Prop 13 and have worked in local government finance and management since then. So I've seen probably as much change as most of you in the audience in the way local governments have been financed. And there has been a historical trend throughout those years for local governments to face some threats. And those threats, generally speaking, fall into two categories. The first is ones that we call objective threats. Those are the ones they can't control. Those are things like the economic boom and bust cycle. Those cycles are accelerating. We've all seen that affect our 401 programs. Expanding federal and state fiscal instability. Who would have thought 20 years ago that the state of California and the federal government would have the kind of financial problems that they're having today? And who can project what impact that will have on us as members of local governments and residents receiving services? They will be significant. And as you know, the governor has proposed some very, very serious changes in the way local government operates for this implementation this year. The other thing that's happened is locally we've lost control of our own revenues. It's very, very difficult now to raise revenue for specific purposes, and very few communities are able to raise the 2/3 majority that it takes to do that. The subjective threats, those are within our control, the ones that we could have managed or perhaps haven't, are that operating costs are growing at excessive rates. Salaries, benefits, and staffing costs have far outstripped the inflation rate. The other thing that's been happening is that long-term liabilities, that is debt, has been undertaken by local governments at an unprecedented rate through a variety of vehicles. Just one mechanism is called a certificate of participation. I don't know if any of you know that, but a lot of cities went down and sold their city halls when they wanted to raise money to redo them. So there's a bunch of debt out there that wasn't there 20 or 30 years ago. And then also, there just hasn't been an accurate understanding of the long-term implications of the increases in cost that have been committed, particularly as it relates to salaries, but more importantly to benefits such as retirement and post-retirement medical costs. We did a study recently for the cities of Millbrae and San Bruno who wanted to consolidate their police departments, and one of the things we did was benchmark 4 comparable jurisdictions in the Bay Area of similar size and general revenue income levels. There were cities of population in the 65 to 75,000 range. Their general fund expenditures ranged from about $750 per resident to about $1,200 per resident. So that's a pretty good spread. The percentage of general fund that they were spending of that total amount that went to public safety, and they all had police and fire departments, ranged from about 44% at the low to about 65%. And that's a significant range. In some of those agencies, the rate of increase has gone from, in the last about 20 years, from about 40% to 65 to 70%. It's a very significant cost increase for those cities because the rate of increase of public safety sworn personnel is higher than it is for non-sworn because of the high cost of the retirements and benefits. And those funds, particularly retirement, are going to accelerate. Believe it or not, in 2002, 2003, the city of Pleasanton paid no dollars into the public employees retirement system. There was a dot-com boom, and for a number of years, CalPERS stopped collecting. By 2004 and 5, they were paying $6 million a year. Last year, they paid $8 million, and in 14-15, they'll be paying $10 million into PERS. You can see the acceleration of those costs over a relatively short period of time are have an extreme impact on their operations. That's also similar to the rate increases in Campbell, Belmont, and San Bruno, which have all accelerated about that same rate and that same amount. The other thing that is occurring is that the pension system, the PERS system, which most public agencies or cities are in, has had some assumptions for its rate of return on its investments, which is officially 7.75% per year. And they project all of their costs based on that return. In some years it's been very, very high, and in other years it's been in the negative range. But for the last 10 years, between the last bust and this bust, their effective rate of return has been 2.88%. And so you can see that they've fallen short of that obligation. So what they did was they did not make a cash call, which is typically what you do, on the employers for that unfunded amount, but they amortized that loss over a 33-year period and assumed a 7.75% rate of return. The problem is that today CalPERS recognizes they aren't going to be able to sustain that rate, and they're probably going to reduce that assumed rate of return. Now, this is kind of archaic, a little academic, but basically what that means is the employers are going to have to pay more. So the cost in the retirement benefits are going to increase at a higher than inflation rate. One of the private sector models that I like to use to discuss what local government and probably state and federal government are going to experience is similar to what the Ford Motor Company went through. As you know, Ford Motor Company was a very successful entity. It was innovative, it was creative, and for many, many years it was very successful. And as you know, it fell on very, very hard times. And in 2006, Bill Ford, who was the CEO at the time, hired a guy named Alan Mulally to come in. And Alan came from Boeing. And at Boeing, he had worked there for 37 years and really created an efficient and effective and very competitive, if there's anything the United States can do, it's build airplanes, let me tell you, a very competitive company. So he took over Ford, and in the second quarter of 2009, they'd lost $400 million. The second quarter of 2010, they turned that into a $2.9 billion profit. As all of you probably know, at one point, Ford Motor Company stock was selling for $1. Today, I think it's $18. But he also did something else. He sold Jaguar, Range Rover, Aston Martin, Volvo, and shut down Mercury. He took the 97 nameplates that they had in that organization, took it down to 60, and now they're on their way to 20. They had 25 platforms, now they have 12. And they have a copy that every employee has of the company's strategy, its economics, and its game plan on an 11 by 17 sheet that every employee in Ford Motor Company has. And all I'm saying to today is that local government needs to take an objective look at what services it provides and how it provides those services. And that's not easy to do, and it certainly was painful for Ford. It was a very, very difficult situation. So the other thing that I'd like to share is that one of the things that we do in Northern California, because I'm a native, is we don't think of much of Southern California. Local government, we don't think much of it. but we don't think about it much either. But Southern California has, a lot of cities have a different approach to providing local services. They contract for services. And there are a number of contract cities in Southern California that have found efficient ways to provide services. And let me just give you a list that are common in Southern California. Risk management, information services, purchasing, engineering, park maintenance, payroll, building inspection, plan check, paratransit services, library operations, custodial services, and police services. Los Angeles County provides a tremendous amount of local law enforcement to different cities throughout Los Angeles County. I was the manager in the city of Citrus Heights, 90,000 population. We contracted for police services with the Sacramento County. In Oakley, we contracted with Contra Costa County. And I found those two contracts to work. I was responsible for them. I negotiated them. They worked for us. We're, as I mentioned, doing a Millbrae-San Bruno consolidation. The peninsula has been hard hit since 2001 downturn, and they are increasingly looking at alternate ways to provide services, same or comparable levels to their communities through innovative ways. Millbrae-San Bruno is talking about consolidating. I think San Mateo Burlingame's been talking about consolidating. San Carlos contracted with the county, and I think they're going to go with CAL FIRE. They're talking about going to CAL FIRE. There's a number of different ways to provide these services to the community of necessity, and looking at them, I think, in an objective way can give a local government the opportunity to address these long-term fiscal issues in a way that can continue to meet the needs of the community. It'll be different. We were in a Northern California community, which will remain unnamed, where Napa County did a countywide meeting about 3 months ago to discuss local government services and how to do cost sharing with local government services, police, fire, everything, some of the ones I mentioned. And one of the small cities said, look, and I think they probably have 1,500, 2,000 residents, we want to keep our police dispatch. Well, police dispatch, I'm not sure how police dispatch for 1,500 residents is pretty expensive per resident. When today the trend is to put police dispatch in a central location and cover those costs through sharing of that time. So anyway, there are some opportunities, there are some other ways to skin the cat, and I'd be glad to answer any questions after Bill's finished.
Thank you. My name is Bill McCammon, and as was mentioned earlier, I have 30 years experience in the fire service. I've worked in a few different departments and spent most of my early years in the San Leandro Fire Department and found myself in a position as the new fire chief. This was back in the late 80s, early 90s, where we were going to have to lose an engine company because of budget cuts. And as someone that cared deeply about the levels of service we provided, and that's not unlike the firefighters in Vallejo here that care very much about the service they provide the community, we were put in a position where we really didn't have any choice on how we were going to move forward. And that really got us looking at how regional service might be provided in our area. And what I'm going to do in a little bit is go into some detail about how we progressed as a fire department, the Alameda County Fire Department. But I want to make a few general comments about regionalized services, because for me personally, in my experience, I believe in that. I believe that you can provide enhanced levels of service to the community, and you can do it at a reduced cost. And so I think it is an option that's very viable and one that we found worked. But some of the things that we're seeing in terms of public safety today, you've seen it here, where police and firefighters are actually getting laid off. And I never thought in my career I would see that. And while Mike spoke to the fact that pensions is a big issue that has continued to be brought forward in terms of some of the reasons for the increased costs of providing fire and police protection, there are other things that have happened to public safety services over the years that have caused that increase in cost. And a lot of that is based around specialization. When I came into the fire service, we were expected to be jack of all trades, and so you were expected to do EMS, hazardous materials, and all of these different things whenever the bell went off. Well, what's happened over the years is the fire service in particular has become more regulated and more specialized, because we have to have training and certifications to do all of those things that we all took for granted 20 years ago. So that's added to the cost of providing fire protection. The fact that now that we're involved in EMS and having paramedics on engine companies in some departments actually do transport. There are increased training costs to do that as well. So it's just overall burdened the system with more costs to provide the service. So when you look at regionalized services, having that specialization, or the ability to specialize in certain areas and spread that cost over a larger body is a much more cost-effective way to provide that service. Some of the things about regionalized service is that you can, in fact, as I mentioned earlier, maintain the service levels at a reduced cost. And local control can be maintained, whether it's a JPA or a contract for service. You can ensure that you have the type of service that you want within your community. When I talk about the Alameda County Fire Department model, I'll explain that a little bit more. There are other things that you can do. You can do a full consolidation of services, or you can partner with surrounding agencies and do just pieces of it. It isn't one size that fits all. As an example, you can consolidate dispatch and have joint dispatch services, joint communications, EMS and training can be consolidated, and you can still have different departments, but they're sharing the resources to do those types of different functions. Some of the successful examples around the state in terms of regionalized models, and probably the largest one is the Los Angeles County Fire Department. There are currently 59 cities that receive their fire protection under contract to the Los Angeles County Fire Department. In Orange County, there's the Orange County Fire Authority, where there are 21 different cities that receive their fire protection from the Orange County Fire Authority. The Sacramento Metropolitan Fire District has 2 cities and 16 fire districts that are part of their department. And then in the Alameda County Fire Department, there are 3 special districts, 4 cities, and 2 national laboratories that receive their fire protection from the Alameda County Fire Department. So some of the obstacles to getting to the point where you actually can provide regionalized services is, the first is just the lack of political will. A lot of elected officials do not want to step up and take that potential risk to be involved in actually promoting the idea of regionalized services. There's a perceived loss of local control, and I want to reiterate a perceived loss, because I can show you examples where jurisdictions are actually getting enhanced levels of service by being part of a regionalized model, and I'll explain that a little bit better. There's issues when you initially talk about regionalized services of equity and disparate levels of service, so there are some things that need to be done up front to determine what a baseline level of service for each organization is going to be. Sometimes there's lack of support from city management, fire management, or organized labor. I've likened this to a planetary alignment sometimes for this to happen, because you have to have the community supporting it, you have to have the elected officials, you have to have city management, fire management, and organized labor all moving in the same direction to make this a successful regionalized effort. Because if any one of those is opposed to this, it's not going to work. And we've seen several examples around the state where regionalized models have come together and they've broken apart because they didn't really have everybody in alignment moving forward. So I can't impress upon you enough how important it is to have everyone at the table when you talk about regionalized services and make sure that everybody's moving in the same direction to do that. So the Alameda County Fire Department, to give you kind of a brief overview of what happened there, in Alameda County prior to 1993, the county had fire protection under 3 different agencies. There was the Castro Valley Fire Protection District, the Eden Fire Protection District, and the Alameda County Fire Patrol, which was actually under the Sheriff's Department at the time. They made a move through LAFCO to consolidate their agencies and create the Alameda County Fire Department. I, at the time, worked for the city of San Leandro. We were adjacent to the Castro Valley Fire Department and the Eden Consolidated Fire Department. And I went to the then city manager, who was sitting to my right, and said, I think it's important that we look at this as an option for our city. We're about to lose an engine company. We had trained everybody that was part of the Eden and Castro Valley Fire Departments because they didn't have a training academy. And I said, I think we should look at this. And so he allowed me to go forward, start discussions with the county. And one of the things that we found when I went out to the community to talk about this is that when you look at fire protection in its own jurisdiction, and I'll use the city of San Leandro and the Alameda County side of this, there's stuff going on all the time. There are engine companies going on medical calls or first alarm assignments that are going on in San Leandro. All the while, there are engine companies very close to the San Leandro border that are in the county that aren't doing anything. And so we saw that as a benefit. If we could consolidate those resources together, we could actually bring additional resources into the city without emptying all of our districts, and we could take those resources that weren't being used in the city and move them over to the county. So we could balance out our response. And it really was effective when we went out to the community to talk about that. So the county formed their fire department in 1993. In 1995, San Leandro consolidated with the Alameda County Fire Department under a contract for service. The contract for service was designed in such a way that the city retained ownership of their fire trucks and their fire stations, and the only thing that really went over to the county were the employees. We consolidated their MOUs. The county firefighters and our firefighters consolidated together, and then San Leandro maintained their service levels through this contract for service. The way we figured the cost model was in such a way, I forgot to mention that I went over to become the first fire chief of the Alameda County Fire Department to start this off. And I quickly learned when I went over there that not everybody thought the county was their friend. And so if we were going to be successful with this regional model and moving it forward, we needed to put a cost model in place that allowed expenses to be shared as the system grew so that people didn't think the county was trying to take advantage of these jurisdictions coming in. So the cost model we worked on had the cost per engine company across the board. The city paid 100% for that cost for those engine companies that they had. Then all the overhead, which included the chief officers, the battalion chiefs, the overtime, the operational costs, was shared based on the number of engine companies that were in the system, and then you became a percentage of those engine companies and paid those operational costs. The benefit to that system, as it grew and we brought in more engine companies, my salary as fire chief got spread over a larger base so that each jurisdiction paid a little bit less. So in 95, San Leandro came in. In 1997, the city of Dublin came in, and San Leandro received a reduced cost for Dublin coming in. We then brought in the Lawrence Berkeley Laboratory, then we brought in the Lawrence Livermore Laboratory, and then just recently, after I retired, the county fire department brought in the cities of Union City and Newark. When they did that, the city of San Leandro received a reduced cost of $300,000 a year because, again, that overhead was spread over a larger body. So that's one example where we're able to show that we could actually save money and provide enhanced services by moving forward on a regional model. So some of the things to think about if you're going to be looking at regionalization for fire protection, the first is to complete a standards of cover model for the jurisdictions involved so you can establish a baseline for what levels of fire protection are provided in the different jurisdictions that might be part of that effort. And the second and most important, and I mentioned this earlier, is to make sure that everybody's at the table moving forward. That includes organized labor, fire management, city management, elected officials, and representatives from the community, because clearly they all have to be working together, and there is a bit of a selling job that has to go forward with the community so that the community understands that they're not giving up control, and at the same time they're not giving up a level of service that's either real or perceived for that community. So you need to develop a community outreach program. And then you have to establish what kind of a model that you want to look at, whether it be a joint powers authority, it could be a contract for service, it could be a sharing of resources. So there's a number of options that are available. San Mateo County is an example. They have a number of small consolidations, but one of the things that they did over there was provide regionalized dispatch for the entire county. So they've been able to drop borders over there without consolidating, but yet reap some of the benefit of having a regionalized model. So the one thing I'd like to leave you with at the end is you consider walking before running. So you might look at possible functional consolidations of different things like EMS or training, communications or administrations, or those other specialized services before maybe going forward with a full consolidation. So that's some thoughts I have. I'd be more than happy to answer questions.
I wanted to, before I open up for questions, I'd like to ask you a question about in these different geographic areas that you've worked in, both in Northern California and Southern California. How did the ball sort of get rolling in terms of looking at it? Is it something that gets set at the policy level? We want to look at this. Is it a city manager level saying, I want to look at this? Is it department heads? Or does it happen in different ways in different places? Because you talked about that political will. I don't know anything about that, but I'd like to hear a little bit more about that.
Well, my experience has been that, generally speaking, historically, a lot of times what happens in more regional settings is that the the mayors and council members in a county typically ask the city managers in that area to try and address common problems. And that's what's happening with increasing frequency. It happened a lot in 91, 92, the downturn. The managers were doing that. And then what happens is the managers get together and complete basically a laundry list of different considerations that could lead to sharing costs for services and reducing costs and improving service. And then they deliver that back to the mayor's conference, and the mayor's conference and the individual cities start to participate at the level they decide they want to. I think to a great degree, though, the economic necessity, it's a difficult motivator to have change occur when there isn't a reason. There isn't an apparent reason. But right now we're seeing a lot of cities looking at these options, and it depends. It can be an aggressive city manager, it can be a council member, it can be a consensus of the council when they have their strategic planning retreat that they want to take a look at this. And we're seeing that more and more frequently. When the councils sit down and start talking about the future in a more long-term perspective, it's not an immediate threat. And it's something you can start looking at. And as Bill said, I think because the peninsula is so geographically compact, they've been sharing services, rubbing elbows for years. You don't drive from one town to the other, you drive into one town from the other. You can't tell where one starts and the other ends. And so they've had those common interests because the fires are on the borders, the fires are right next door, the law enforcement. So there's more commonality already in those cities, and they're finding it easier to move into those conversations. And especially when you have a lot of smaller jurisdictions, a lot of the newly incorporated cities in California have contract services simply because it is the most cost-effective way to deliver that service. If you can afford to have your own police department, great, but generally speaking, the newly incorporated cities, because of the state law changes here about 15 years ago, make it very difficult to incorporate a city, so they have to be as cost-effective as they can.
Do you want to add anything, Jack?
I would tend to agree. I've seen it at the elected level, the senior staff level, the organized labor level, initiating the process of let's just take a look at this and see if we can maintain the same or an enhanced level of service in the community with a better cost structure for all concerned and still maintaining local political control. And I can think of one right now here in Northern California where there's some organizations that are pretty far along considering a transfer of services from one workforce, merging it into another, and the employees would like to think it was their idea, senior staff would like to think it was their idea, and some elected officials are convinced it was their idea. So across the board, you'll get that, but I think it goes to Bill's point, which is irrespective of where the kernels start gurgling up, getting everybody involved and make it a success for all, and all can take credit for this success, is critical. Because if you don't have everybody rowing their oars at the same time, this thing ain't going to work.
Mm-hmm. And so it doesn't really make a difference one way or another isn't more effective than another necessarily. It's just getting everybody to the table, it sounds like, is the most important
Getting everybody
thing.
on the same page, getting everybody involved in the process. I don't know what matters where the bud comes out of the dirt. As long as everybody is tilling it, watering it, and making it grow, it's going to be okay.
Yeah, I would agree. And it's, you can't force it. So as quick as you can get everybody to the table to start talking about it so that people don't think that there's some sort of a hidden plan, I think it works best.
Just an example, Yolo County recently had, I think it's West Sac, Davis, Woodland, and one other small city had chief vacancies up, either existing or coming up. And the managers got together and said, why do we need 4 more chiefs here? Can we still be a moderate-sized department and have one chief and consolidate and effectively take advantage of all the things Bill described? And that one's happening virtually overnight, as I understand it. I mean, they just said, this makes sense. They all have financial issues, and so they're moving right ahead with that. And that happened within, that from conception to implementation is going to be less than a year.
In our particular case, there's probably no less than 30 gold badges that went away from chief officers that we didn't need without cutting any engine company or service level to the community itself, because we're able again to spread those over a larger base. And there's creative ways that you can attrition people out. We never laid off one person to do any of this. And so everybody coming to the table has to understand that there's a long-term goal, and in the short term, you might not realize all the cost savings initially, but if you plan for the long term, you will get there because you can attrition people out over time.
Jack, I'm going to have to steal your mic to walk around and ask questions, so I'm going to ask you guys to share, but I'm also going to ask you another question while I'm getting ready. Maybe you guys can share this mic together. You know, one of the things that's the most, I don't know how I'm supposed to get this out, but yeah, thank you. One of the most recent, I think one of the most recent examples of sort of regionalizing that is really familiar and fresh in everybody's mind is San Carlos, and I think you worked on that, is that correct?
Yeah.
Could you talk a little bit about maybe kind of how that came about, the process, and how they're doing, because it's only been, what, 5 or 6 months at this point since they regionalized last August, September, I think?
Again, my role is as legal counsel to try to provide a process that makes sense once the policy-making decision has been made. So we receive a call from a client, San Carlos. They're well along the way of negotiating a contract with the county to take the police service and merge it into the county workforce. This means take the city's police officers and move them over to be county sheriff's deputies. So there's really 2 separate legal negotiations that need to occur. The city's senior staff is now negotiating with their peers in the county for a legal relationship in which the county is going to agree to provide a service to the city, and the city in exchange is going to pay a fee or a series of fees. There's that kind of buyer-seller contract that has to occur. Then you have the labor side of the house, which is where someone like me would come in, where we need to talk with our existing workforce, the existing employees. Under California law, it's fairly well settled that if the reason why an agency wants to regionalize services in a manner that causes the existing workforce to either be dissolved or to be moved into another organization, if cost savings is really at the heart of the reason for that, that's a negotiable issue. What does that mean? Under California law, we have a half dozen or more different statutes that provide that in public service, our public servants will have the opportunity to be organized into what are called bargaining units. They will then have the opportunity in these bargaining units to choose to represent themselves or to hire a professional union to represent them on their behalf. Okay. What I describe this to my clients as, we basically have a process of marriage without the possibility of divorce. Okay? We will always have public agencies. They will always have elected officials at their head. They will always have senior staff. They will always have a workforce that will always be organized. What you have here is labor and management are married. There's no way they can divorce one another. You bloody well better find a way to get along. And so these laws say that if we want to do something that affects the underlying wages, working hours, or working conditions of the workforce, we have to talk about it. In the marriage, one of the key elements is that communication. So the law is fairly well set that if you want to outsource, you want to regionalize, you want to contract out for services, that's something that falls under this umbrella of what's negotiable. So in we go to meet with these police officers to discuss, A, are they willing to agree to go? And B, if so, how is that going to occur? Okay. So we were talking about with them really this dual track at the exact same time. Working with them on what's the financials on this, how is this advantageous for public service? How is it advantageous for the city of San Carlos? How might it be advantageous for them? And without getting into too much of the blood and guts of what goes on in the bargaining room, there's an awful lot of questions that well-meaning public servants are going to have about the services they're providing to the community, and candidly, about their own wages and benefits. How is this going to affect them? That you need to chew through with real facts. Try to identify for them, is this in fact a move that makes sense? And then at the same time, look at all the impacts of this decision of people moving from one place to the other, and identify what are we going to do in terms of an employment contract that's going to empower this process to move a workforce from small city police officers to jumping into the big pool of now county sheriff's employees. And I can go for an hour on that. Of all the details of the things you need to talk about, and I can, if that's what you'd like, or specific questions people have. All the details that need to be worked out of what happens to people's wages, their benefits, their leave accruals, their retirement pension, their medical benefits when they retire, their uniforms, their take-home vehicles, and a whole host of other details. We jump in there, we negotiate all that stuff. And when the deal's signed on the dotted line, what inevitably happens with public agencies is they almost start a little bit of buyer's remorse in my experience. Wait a minute, this move's going to cost us a little more money at first than we thought it was. moving these people. Now we've got to buy them new uniforms, we've got to buy out their vacation accruals, we've got to buy out their compensatory leave time, and we've got to deal with somehow now funding this retired medical benefit we promised them, and they're not going to be working in the future for that, so we've got to find a way to fund that. And there usually is some startup cost. What I tell my client is if you've made the policy decision to move to a regionalizing model, keep your eye on the ball. Look at the year after year after year after year after year savings and economies of scale you're going to get, and look at it as a corporation does. Okay? Look at it as the Ford Motor Company does. They bring in their Boeing expert, who's the expert at complex assembly lines in the whole world. And they look at now consolidating functions globally with a lot of startup costs. And now they're down to, 12 platforms worldwide. And you can go to Europe, you can go to Japan, you can go to South America, you can go to your local Ford dealer and buy the same Ford Fiesta in the United States, for the most part, that you can buy anywhere else. Because they accepted the engineering startup costs and ended up with a thing that's going to make them more money, or in the case of public service, save them money year after year after year after year going forward.
So have the three of you seen any entities at all that have regionalized or contracted or done any combination that then did it and then said, this isn't really working, and have decided to go back?
Well, there have been some as a council member I used to work for, used to say there have been some near miss hits. They've started and not gotten there. And I think Union City Fire and Fremont tried it. And unfortunately it wasn't, that I believe anyway, and that was just between them, but I don't think the contract is well defined enough. And the service levels were, I think, not, the contract wasn't defined enough so that both parties felt it was working satisfactorily. But that's generally because I think an imperfect model was conceived of starting up. It's pretty straightforward. And I think, as Jack said, you have to be willing to pay what it costs to get the services in your community that you want. You can't just join up with a larger group and drain their services. You have to pay what your fair share is. And when you do that, it works really well because it is transparent. And actually the service levels increase because in Bill's sense, and the same thing would be in law enforcement, you have a lot more resources available much more quickly. And the emergency nature of both police and fire means you need bodies and you need equipment and you need services quickly and in a high number on some certain events. So I think that's really what the gain is that depth. And then also the lower management cost. Overhead is huge. Alameda County had 11 chiefs. Well, that meant there were 22 deputy chiefs, and everybody had a secretary and a car and the whole thing. And Bill said 30 gold badges. That is millions and millions and millions of dollars. It's not a small amount of money. And I would say that my experience has been that those larger agencies, by and large, can be more professional much more easily because they have that broader scope and they have more resources to do what they need to do.
And sometimes when the first stab at consolidation doesn't work, people take a look, they step back, they learn their lessons, and they take another shot at it. Mentioned San Carlos earlier with the fire. They've been in a partnership with a neighboring agency for a number of years to provide joint fire services. I think all concerned have decided that's not really working, so San Carlos is now looking at a different type of regionalization, call it Cal Fire, see if they can do it for us. So sometimes it doesn't work. I think the fact that it was not well planned at the front end, all the stakeholders were not involved in the process in a respectful way, okay? And where there were freeloaders in the process, people weren't paying their fair share, are at the root of what I see of the things that don't seem to work so well.
With that, let's open the floor for questions. Berkey.
What I've heard you talk mostly tonight is 98% fire and 100% in areas that are already right next door to one another. The city of Vallejo is really not next door to anything. The closest next door is Benicia. So how are you going to consolidate police in the city of Vallejo so it encompasses the whole county?
Let me just mention fire.
Berkey's a retired police officer. Thank you, Berkey.
Let me just mention fire from my perspective. They can
I
answer
was
that.
asking about police specifically.
Okay, well,
I was asking specifically police because this thing is listed, this form is listed as public safety, which includes police and fire. So my question dealt specifically with police.
Well, I'll give you the police-specific answer first, and then Bill can give you the fire answer specifically. The only experience I have had in contracting for law enforcement services, as I mentioned, was in two cities. That was Citrus Heights, population 90,000. We were the first city to incorporate in Sacramento County in a 50-year period or so, and we contracted with the county for law enforcement services. We negotiated that agreement, we negotiated the service levels, we negotiated all the terms and conditions. They had Citrus Heights cars, their uniforms were different than the county's. They were different than the LA County model because they were Citrus Heights for all intents and purposes, and we picked every one of those officers. We selected them based on a criteria that we had, and we had the ability to send them back to the county if there were any sort of issues with their performance. The more established model was in Contra Costa County, which has been providing law enforcement services for many more years than Citrus Heights, or than Sacramento County had in Citrus Heights. And it's a very similar model. I think a little more generous in some of its leave provisions, in the sense that, as you are aware, 4850 time for a local government that has its own police department is a huge liability. An officer can be off for 2 years collecting leave time, and when they're injured, Sac County made the cities pay for that. Contra Costa County doesn't. But my sense is that if this county wanted to look at that corporately, they would have to look at a broader scale of services and an agency that would overall be responsible for those law enforcement activities for a larger geographic area. Now, I don't know the specifics of this county. We haven't taken a look at it, we haven't studied it, we haven't talked about it. It's just not what we've been doing. So I can't answer that question for you tonight. Just don't know.
But maybe along the lines of law enforcement, I can give you an example. In Alameda County is the Alameda County Sheriff's Department, and I work there now on this communications project. They provide services to the city of Dublin. They provide services to the unincorporated area, which is on the west side of the county. They also have responsibility for the far east side of the county, where they have patrol vehicles out there. They provide contract services to the Oakland Airport, to the Oakland Coliseum, to Laney College, and to AC Transit, and then they also run the courts. So they really have an area that's probably equal to or larger than the area in Solano County that you're talking about, where they provide services to multiple agencies through contracts, and they're able to do that.
I'll just sort of caboose this then. There's a lot of different ways it hypothetically could be done. Does it make sense in this community? I don't know. It's not my job. What I will say is your question implies one particular type of model, taking one city and working with a colleague city and doing a singular service as partnership cities. That's one possible hypothetical model. Another might be working with a county. Okay, immediately to the north here, American Canyon. You roll through American Canyon, you see one of those American Canyon PD Dodge Chargers or Magnums. My understanding is that those folks are county sheriff's deputies. That's another model. I think that's what we saw in San Carlos. Now, does that model work for Vallejo? That's for policymakers and all the stakeholders to decide. In terms of the hypothetical options, taking like-minded cities, bringing them together, that's one way of doing it. Working with a county, that's another. Taking a large number of cities, not just two, a whole bundle of them, preferably in one county, but not necessarily. Creating a general, larger metro PD with not necessarily contiguous lines. You might have some hopscotch spots in the middle that's county sheriff territory, so that metro PD is not all connected as one entity. That's another hypothetical model that may or may not work for the stakeholders. Don't that answer your question squarely.
Question for you. The Solano County has a countywide ambulance service, and which serves as a second responder, and the local fire department serves as a first responder on medical calls. Does it have to be that way, or can that be changed?
There are a number of options that the county could look at in terms of how they provide service. In our particular case in Alameda County, we thought it was important to have the paramedics on the engines. So we had medic engines, because those engines, for the most part, are always available within the community and can get there quicker than the ambulances. The ambulances were under contract to the county, So they had, because of the cost of providing ambulance services, a reduced number, so that putting the medics on the engine companies allowed us to stabilize people and then have the transport ambulances come in with a longer response time. We were also able to get some revenue for the local jurisdictions based on having those medic engine companies. But there are a number of different models out there. There are some jurisdictions that do fire-based transport. And in our particular case, we thought it was more important to have the medics on the engine than to actually do the transporting.
Does anybody else have any questions?
Back to what you said about how management and the unions are basically married and they have to get along or it's not going to work. In your experience, since fire and police, law enforcement rely on the taxpayers to get the ball moving or not moving, would this be put on a ballot for the taxpayers to decide, since they are relying on the taxpayer money to get it, to even pay them anyways?
Well, in the cases that I've been involved in Alameda County, they've all been contracts for service. And while we went out and educated the community, there was never a vote taken. The city councils made those decisions, and it was basically under their authority or purview to make decisions on how they wanted to provide those services. But clearly, if we hadn't gone out to the community to build support, the community would have come back to the councils and basically said, no, we don't want to do this. And so that was the option, but there was never a vote taken.
I will say I've seen the issue of should there be a vote come up in a number of the matters that I've handled. Candidly, commonly the should there be a ballot initiative or should there be a vote issue comes up as a poison pill. One stakeholder is not interested in this. They want to delay the process, stop the process by having some kind of a vote on something. In some places it's effective, in some places it's not. Every place is unique and different. But does there need to be a specific vote on this issue? Will depend upon, what's the charter of the particular organization, say if it's a charter city. Usually, though, I think I agree that this is something that policymakers and labor are working on together. And if the electorate isn't pleased, they make themselves known.
Do you have a question, Robert?
One of the largest concerns we have is funding pension-related costs, which is applicable to employees after they've left our employment. If you were able to craft a bill, putting into that bill everything you would like to see accomplished and be able to pass it through the state legislature, what are some of the key provisions you would like to see in that type of legislation?
Don't all jump at once.
I guess from my perspective, seeing some of the jurisdictions that were actually pulling money out of the system when the system was doing well, I don't think that should be allowed. And clearly that was a problem for some jurisdictions where they were living off the returns that CalPERS was receiving rather than leaving it there for times like this when they needed the money to be in there. So that was one thing I would see.
It's a difficult question to answer because it's a complex problem, but to me, pension reform is really critically important in the sense that since 1999, the pensions of most public employees moved from being that had the improved levels, moved from being retirement income to an income replacement program, and it became a substantially larger percentage of their final year's income, and it's very difficult to sustain that. I think we see that globally. We see that in the United States. We see it in European countries. That's a very difficult thing to financially support because it's based on a demographic, and that demographic goes away. We are an aging country compared to a number of other nations. And so we're experiencing that right now, Social Security and these other issues. So I think the key is to return that pension portion of the total cost of that compensation of that employee to a reasonable amount and maintain that so that it cannot be manipulated, which right now, unfortunately, it can be. It didn't used to be what it is today. It used to be a very healthy retirement assist is one of the three legs of the stool, right? Social Security, your own savings, and some sort of pension program. Unfortunately, it's not a sustainable element. To me, that is a large percentage of it. Total compensation is what I always look at, and how those costs for that employee compared to the private sector, although it's particularly with public safety very difficult to do. And no one is saying that public safety personnel don't risk their lives on a frequent basis and do dangerous jobs and perform important jobs. But the point is that overall, how does that relate to the total ability of the community to support that cost? And most, I think, public safety folks recognize that that current level is not sustainable for the longer term.
I'm not going to sit here and make policy suggestions for you. What I will say is, having sat in a lot of negotiation sessions with a lot of different union professionals over the last year or so, everybody out there knows pensions are a big issue, and financially it's something that there's a broad consensus needs to be tackled. Among the things that I hear from various random union type folks that they're willing to discuss are things such as, what should the retirement ages be? 50, 55, 60, where should that line be drawn? Those are things they're willing to converse about. What should the formulation be? What amendments to the CalPERS contract should be allowable? Should there be one uniform across the entire state, or should employers and unions be able to agree to have enhancements to how the formulation is crafted using the favorite tools that single highest year? I think that's probably something that's up for discussion. I think these are the elements that you're going to see. My third-hand information when I talk to folks in SEIU, AFSCME, Teamsters, they say that there are discussions going on at the state level, that there's the classic smoke-filled room bargaining going on as to what the pension reform should look like, and it appears, from my limited information, when the governor made his, speech, what was it, 3 weeks ago, about what he's going to do with the state budget, the one big issue he left out was pension, for the simple reason that he realizes it's such a big deal that it merits some kind of behind-the-scenes discussion to cobble something together first before it gets rolled out to the public. How does the public respond to that? Well, that's up to us as the public to decide.
Hello there, my name's Joey Porter. Question. Obviously you've got to develop some kind of interest on a city level. There's got to be a level within the politicians of the city. But how do you develop that interest? We're looking for a partner, and we go to Solano County, and Solano County may not be interested, or how do you, is that done in an interpersonal relationship between different members of city councils? Is that something that, public forums like this in different communities?
It's called political will. I think we heard about that earlier. You guys, go for it.
Just a quick note on that too. I think persistence is really important. I think one of the things that's going to be happening, we are only at the beginning of the financial impact of what's been happening for cities and counties, and it's not going to get better soon. So I think the continued discussion of these subjects, and more of a policy level sort of, not that you're talking specifically about let's do it this way, but how can we achieve a more cost-effective way to deliver these services and preserve these services? And Bill was talking about the ambulance service. It reminds me when I was in San Leandro and started working there, which was about 100 years ago, the ambulance service was provided by the police department. There was an old gray ambulance that was parked out behind the city hall, and the guy on beat number 1 would get the call. He would drive down there from wherever he was in beat 1, get the ambulance, and drive it out to your house. And another guy would meet him out there, and they'd literally throw whoever it was in the ambulance. Now that probably took Bill 15 minutes to accomplish. If you compare that with the service level today, when you have a firefighter who's a paramedic at your front door in 3 minutes, and has a tremendous amount of resources, including calling the hospital directly, that's a huge sea change. But that's also someone who, that's a lot of training and that's a lot of expense in order to have that. So we're going to have to pay more for services. The question is, how can you get that quality of service and do it in a cost-effective way? And that's really the question of breaking down the barriers so that you can get that ambulance service or that immediate emergency service, but you don't have to localize it to the extent that it's unnecessary.
Bill, I just wanted to add to that because it just seems like in Southern California there is a lot more political willingness to explore this. And I don't know if it just goes to what Berkey said earlier, which is the geography of just physically being closer. Maybe. It certainly seems easier to digest and to think about when you have, like on the peninsula in Southern California, that you don't know when you've left Bell, California, for example, and we've all heard of Bell, right? And somewhere else, so I can see how just that geography makes it really easy to have the conversation, but there has to be more to it than just that in terms of, I don't know if there's a whole culture down there that's different than up here.
There was, and excuse me, it was called the Lakewood model, and it was when all of these cities after the war started to incorporate, and it was a model that brought those cost-effective services to the community, so that the community didn't have to reinvent the wheel in order to become a city. They had land use control and they had a lot of other controls, but they contracted for those services, and it was a well-known model. It just didn't get to Northern California as quickly and as thoroughly as it did in the Los Angeles area.
Well, along the lines of how you get this started, I'm involved in a two-county regional communication system for police, fire, and general government, and there are 36 agencies that are part of that. We're building out a system for Alameda and Contra Costa County. That started with a number of us police chiefs and fire chiefs getting together and saying, we've got 15 different systems in the two counties that don't work. They're getting to the end of their useful lives. We started working on it ourselves, and then we took it to the city managers. Well, then we got city managers involved, and then they said, well, we need to get elected officials involved. So then we went to the mayor's conferences in both counties and got elected officials as part of the team that worked as a task force that ultimately formed the JPA. So I think to answer your question, it can start anywhere, but clearly it takes leadership. It takes people standing up and pursuing this and continuing to bring people together to talk about it for anything to happen.
When I talk to my clients and they're starting to ask me questions about this subject, more often than not, it's the product of the fact that we live in a small world. Elected officials go to conferences together, they meet one another, they shake hands, they talk. City managers do it, fire chiefs do it, police chiefs do it, and the internet has made the communication all more. If you need to know somebody else's labor agreement, it may very well be posted on the agency's website, and everybody's got listserv. You'd be amazed how often public officials are shooting emails to the listserv and getting feedback from their colleagues all over this state. And so that creates these personal relationships. It causes the information to get around. Gives people the opportunity to early on build some trust, talk with one another, sketch out what some models might be. I see a lot of it just starting through that kind of word-of-mouth relationship building, which really, when you think about it, what's at the heart of making a lot of this work? Good quality relationships. Allows a lot of it to get started.
Does anybody else have a question? Kim?
I wanted to thank you for coming and visiting our city. And if you need recommendations on restaurants, talk to us afterwards.
Now you're getting to the really important part. Well done, sir.
I wanted to ask you if you have a rough idea of how many regional arrangements exist in the state of California, and also do they exist also outside of the state of California?
Just one bit of information. When the Napa County folks got together here about 3 or 4 months ago, they brought someone in from the International Association of Police Chiefs. And he is actually a facilitator who works to conduct one-day strategic planning and discussion sessions for local agencies that are considering consolidating police services. And I know that it's happening on a nationwide level from that perspective. And they have on their website a lot of good information if you want to check the Chiefs of Police website. And I don't know, I couldn't begin to tell you. I would say that, in the state of California, there's hundreds of those different kinds of agreements. Just to give you an example, and this is one that we started in 91, 92 in Alameda County, the question came up on street pavement, on paving contracts. I don't know if any of you have worked in public works, but you go out to bid in your city once a year, or if you've got the money to have street sections replaced or repaved. And there's nothing more efficient than having a contract that covers your entire county, and it's spec'd out every square foot that needs to be paved, and you go out and you bid that thing together. And you'll get a rate that costs about half as much as it does to individually do it in your different jurisdictions. And all you need, generally speaking, you don't need as many engineers, you don't need as many inspectors, you don't need as many spec writers, you don't need as many purchasing agents. You just think about those sorts of things. So that those kinds of economies can be accomplished on a countywide basis typically, or even a regional basis over time. And I think that's what, generally speaking, the economics are going to force us to relook at how we accomplish things in that way. Every time there's a downturn, it becomes more popular.
Perky, you have your hand up.
I want to go on what you just said. Today, we're all thinking of ways to save money. Let's say we get to the point where we have 58 regional police agencies. That'd be one for each county. As a police officer, I think that's great. As a private citizen, I'm starting to say, wait a minute. We only have 58 police agencies in the state. What's it going to take for those 58 police officers to come together and form one union for the entire state? It just seems to me we're going down a slippery slope here that sounds good today, but what about the big picture when we get down, like I say, just 58 counties, and they're a single agency, but then the police get together, the officers, and say, wait a minute, we can do a whole lot better if we just become one agency. I don't want to see a police state, but when you're talking consolidating down to 58, and then maybe one police agency, that's not what I want to see. I don't care how much money you're going to save. That ain't what I want to see. And yeah, is it going to happen tomorrow? No. Is it going to happen next year? No. But if we go down what you people are proposing to do in law enforcement, you're going to eventually end up, in my opinion, one police agency in the state of California. I don't want to see that. I was a police officer for 30 years, and I definitely don't want to see that.
Can I just clarify a question? The Lakewood plan was, the city of Lakewood in Southern California actually started out as a contract city, and they started this whole model of contracting out in the 50s, right?
Correct.
And didn't they contract out to, I don't know, who they contract out to, the sheriff's department or?
LA County Sheriff.
LA County Sheriff.
Yeah.
So they've been doing it now for 50, I mean, they're still a city, so what?
Yeah, whatever it is.
60 years?
Yeah, something like that.
Okay, so apparently it's working for them.
And again, I didn't mean to mislead you. I'm not looking at a one world police department. I think the point though being is, and this is where the issue is, and maybe it's too academic and not emotional enough, but there's an economy of scale. There's a point where every time you break that unit into a smaller component, your efficiency drops. That's a fact. And so when a city of 1,500 has an entire police dispatch and has somebody running a little jail and has, an officer for this and an officer for that, the cost per unit of service goes up. And it's very difficult to achieve to me, the economies, but then also this quality of service can suffer. And maybe that's what some agencies want. I worked in Oakley, we had a volunteer fire. We had a combination department. And the city felt it worked well for years. When it was a very, very small city, et cetera, it did. Now that city is concerned because they have inadequate coverage on their fire. But the point being that I'm not looking at a one-world system at all, and I'm sure that would never happen, just from the experiences that I've seen. But the real key, I think, again, is to try and make things as economical and make as much sense as they can for the jurisdictions. The key is, San Leandro, we kept the engines, we owned the fire stations, and we committed to the community that if it didn't work, hey, you just write the checks. Same check gets written. You're gonna get your guys back. I mean, that was and you can always change that, and that's the way it works. Citrus Heights, for a variety of reasons, decided because they had some issues with Sac County, they were going to do their own police department. So they did, and it cost them more money, but they're happy with it. Well, and they're paying for it. I mean, you never lose that control.
I think that, again, we're here to just provide basic information today, identify what are the working pieces if this is something that an organization's interested in looking at. But the basic hypothesis of we're heading in the direction of, for example, law enforcement, 58 law enforcement organizations that will then consolidate into one, I think it's a highly unlikely hypothesis. For the simple reason, one of the essential elements of success of regionalizing is that everybody has to pay their fair share, or politically it becomes untenable, and financially it becomes untenable. The economies of scale you can achieve in Siskiyou County are on an order of magnitude nowhere near what you can achieve in LA County. And the free rider problem you're going to have with outlying counties is so tremendous, you're just not going to see this issue. Where I have clients asking me about regionalization is in areas that are higher population, we have a large number of municipal corporations side by side, shoulder by shoulder. So San Mateo County, the 9-county Bay Area, all the Southern California areas. So those areas have a lot of public organizations. This is a discussion I see going on. But when I get out into a lot of the other more rural counties in this state, where you have 1 or 2 or 3 on the larger side municipalities that are not generally physically touching one another, there's usually no discussion about merging those 2 or 3 cities, nor is there much discussion, if any, about taking a city or 2 and merging them with the county, because the nature of the service is just so different. The economies of scale are so different. So at least in my experience, it's more of a large population center, lots of public agencies issue. And if you look at, we've talked about San Carlos some, how many municipal organizations do you have in the county of San Mateo? It is not going to happen that all the elected officials and all the unions and all the mid-managers and all the senior staff and all those organizations decide we're going to have a metro PD across all those dozens of local public agencies. It's not going to happen.
Hi, Ann Meter. I've lived in Vallejo for about 20 years, 12 years at Mariners Landing. And perspectives is always an interesting thing because from my perspective, I feel like Vallejo has been a one-police state. And I know that's in disagreement probably with members of the crew here, but it's what you're talking about is reorganization, which is a term that I heard probably about 20 years ago working in corporate America. When corporate America was inefficient, they reorganized. And there really wasn't any discussion about it, as upper management simply did it. And it seems like our government, the way we deliver services, needs to be reorganized and has needed to be reorganized for many, many years. And Vallejo's bankrupt. We were the first city to have to declare bankruptcy. And we still seem to be struggling along. We have contracts in place that have, and it's hard for me to understand this, that we have a contract in place where our police officers got a 7% raise this past July. And I work for a company where our raises were frozen for a couple of years, and the max raise that was given out this past year was 3%. And you had to actually perform to get that 3%. But perhaps we're getting into issues here that do reflect the pain of our community. And it is hard to see that public employees can retire at 50, making 90% of their salaries, when I'm putting 23% of my salary in a 401k so I can retire when I'm 66 and not starve.
And is there a question?
Sorry. No, that's fine. Does it, when you look at Vallejo and the surrounding area, does it make sense? To me, it makes sense that Vallejo, Benicia, American Canyon, even Suisun City, all have regionalized services. I don't understand why it isn't like that.
We have another question if you don't want to take a step. Thank you, Ann. I'm not sure if this is in the realm of what we're talking about tonight, but it's a good point you bring up, this reorganization. And I've been reading articles lately about, I think Marty was investigating, there was one city nearby whose police and fire department are one and the same, where they have a chief that oversees Sunnyvale. And I don't know if you've seen models like that. I've also been reading, there's an article in the New Yorker last week about Camden, New Jersey, and they do a lot of tracking of statistics, and they deliver services based on those statistics. Like, for instance, they realize that a lot of their hospital bills are coming from certain particular areas, like the senior centers, and so they set up
their emergency services to deal with that. I don't know if you've done any kind of reorganization that just looks at different models.
The Sunnyvale model has been around for probably 20 plus years. And while it sounds good at face value, I think one of the things that I started out with in my presentation was to talk about specialization and the need for specialization based on regulation that's come into both police and fire. And so what happens is you can't do both, and you can't do both well. And so while the Sunnyvale model purports that you are getting a police officer and a firefighter interchanging, for the most part, once you become one, you stay usually in that discipline. So it isn't quite the panacea that it's thought to be. And I think there's one other, I think you said Jack, Roner Park does that. And they tend to maybe be more areas that don't have high volume response requirements. And I would say that in your particular case here, you have a high volume response, and you would want to make sure that those people that are trained in that one discipline are in that discipline and not trying to move back and forth between disciplines.
What I see in agencies that have what are most often called public safety officers, it's usually the label they use when they have that joint function, is the skill set of law enforcement and firefighter life-saving are so different that you don't really have people, for the most part, spending a year in patrol car and then a year in the firehouse. It just doesn't work. What you do often have, though, is some economies of scale in the employment and legal relationship. You very often have negotiated one labor agreement with one large group instead of two labor agreements. And all this takes time and money to do. So that public safety officer, whether they're in the patrol car or in the ambulance or the fire engine, is making generally the same compensation. So there may be some savings there. But what gets really interesting is when you're now doing mutual aid, it's working with an organization with the bifurcated structure instead of the unified structure where things get interesting.
Did you have a question?
So if I understood you correctly, first of all, the system we're using in Vallejo right now, in light of the bankruptcy and all that, isn't working. So we really have to look at how we can make that more efficient. And if I understood you correctly, Governor Brown has recently indicated that he's going to be putting a lot more pressure on local agencies to spend money that we don't have. So he's not going to make that any easier for any of these agencies. And also, I believe that there are probably hundreds of agencies right now throughout the state of California that are looking at this regionalization issue because this is going to be the way of the future. Is that what you're seeing?
Well, I think we're seeing the activity levels pick up. I think what's happening is, my experience has been that the city and Vallejo went through it. Your assistant city manager, Craig Whittam, was on a lead panel with me here this last fall. Vallejo put together a 5-year revenue expenditure model in order to be able to come out of bankruptcy. The judge requires that. And Citrus Heights has a 10-year. If you look down the road and you look at the future in local government today, increasing costs and a static revenue base are going to force some changes. And so I think there's a lot of discussion about how to change. Not all agencies embraced all of these same benefit packages in the same way. Contra Costa County, the officers voted to pay for it. They're paying for that cost. And some of those officers are paying $1,500 a month into their retirement, $2,000 a month for that benefit, that increased cost for that benefit. The city of Newark, similar situations occurred. So there are a variety of things happening in the pay and benefit structure and the employee cost and staffing models. But unfortunately, there isn't one centralized kind of like, this is the way everybody's doing it. The trends haven't really been established. I don't know, Jack, if you see it, but everybody's trying things, and some are regionalization intensive because the fire services have a tendency to be able to fall into that category more readily. People have concerns with police because it's not a familiar model, it's a new model. And so I think they're happening in different ways, but generally speaking, over the next 5 years, the focus will be on that sort of how do we do this in a different way so that we can provide that service, but we don't incur that same level of cost.
Anybody else have any questions? Sorry.
Quick question about your models, specifically a county and a city, basically Vallejo and Solano County. With 2 weak budgets, both the county and Vallejo, how will that model work with the initial startup and things like that? Have you seen 2 weak budgets being able to start up? I'm addressing you, the attorney, I'm sorry.
I am not an expert at the city of Vallejo budget nor Solano County's, right? I'm not going to give you how would it work with these 2 specific agencies. I can show you the general tools in the toolbox. How they would be applied to build a particular house, I don't know, okay? What I can say is, if you have 2 agencies that are struggling, whether they're 2 cities, 2 towns, a county and a city, a group of municipalities, generally speaking, in my experience, finances are a key motivator to get the parties to talk about a consolidation effort, okay? There's usually a very near-term financial motive, a need to see savings in this fiscal year that is behind that. One way or another, the budget's either going to balance, or the reserves are going to get used to plug the gap, or once the reserves are gone, very definitive things are going to start to happen to make sure that that budget balances, okay? And that's where we've gotten to the point that was mentioned earlier. We're in a place in this state where, amazingly now, there's police officers and sheriff's deputies and firefighters who've actually been laid off. Never thought I'd see it. The budget will balance, okay? So if you've got 2 organizations that are financially struggling, and they're talking about teaming up to provide a service to achieve the economies of scale these gentlemen have ably talked about, to get to have, 1 head instead of 2, okay? To have 1 layer of senior management instead of 2. All right, to do 1 training module instead of 2. In my experience, the startup costs in year 1 have never exceeded the savings in year 1, and that's one of the things I keep my city council, my town council, my board of supervisors keenly aware of. In year 1, you're projecting to save as much as you would save in year 2, 3, 4. Your year after year savings is X. Okay. What you need this year in terms of savings is X minus whatever. The X minus whatever is usually what I advocate for in closed session to be my play money. Okay, let me use this money to reinvest back into this unit so that an employee is not left with 5 uniforms hanging in a closet that are now DOA, not dead on arrival, not usable. We're going to invest the money to buy the new green uniforms for them when they jump into that sheriff's patrol car and all the other things that go. So usually there's a way, looking at your math, to make sure you can get some year 1 savings, and then a lot of year after year savings every year thereafter. Because one way or another, it's going to zero out. Okay?
Just one quick note too on Orange County Fire that I think Bill quoted. I don't know how many different agencies came out of the Orange County bankruptcy. That's when they got very serious about discussing how they were going to address their costs because they'd lost so much money, and they had to move forward. The other thing is that the cities of Pacific Grove, Carmel, Monterey, Seaside, and Marina are all facing significant financial challenges, and they are all talking now about joint services, and that's not out of strength. Pacific Grove is really at a terrible time. Monterey is more stable. Carmel is so small that it's having difficulties, and they're working through what they can and can't put together and they're not immediately contiguous because it's a long way from Marina down to Carmel. But the point being, they're actively exploring. All of their managers and their councils have said, let's take a look at all of these services that we can work on. It's not being a total home run because obviously there's usually some guy out in the middle of somewhere who decides you're not going to have it happen. But the point being that they're seriously looking.
Can you give us some real life examples of savings that you've seen, not in the initial year, because I know that that's not your standard, but once you're actually kind of up and running, whether it's regionalizing, contracting, shared services, some examples of that you might know off the top of your head, and if you don't, I apologize for putting you on the spot, for some cost savings that you've seen jurisdictions really save or cost more and decide to go back. Maybe that's another example you could give.
Well, the one that the big initial savings off the top was dispatch services. We formed consolidated fire dispatch center for agencies within Alameda County that wanted to participate. We put it out at the Lawrence Livermore National Laboratory because it had a facility that we could use. Initially, it was the city of Alameda, the Alameda County Fire Department, and the city of Union City that went in there. From there, the city of Fremont looked at getting rid of their dispatch services, and they consolidated in and saved $800,000 a year because they were actually physically staffing 3 full-time dispatchers 24/7. And they didn't need to do that anymore because, again, when we created the joint dispatch center, we charged based on a per-call basis. So you paid proportionally on that. Hazardous materials response. Prior to the consolidation of the Alameda County Fire Department, several jurisdictions tried to have their own hazmat response teams. When we consolidated, we made one team that was fully staffed that responded to the entire area in that part of the county, and that was a great savings because we didn't need to have as many fully trained, specialized people to do that. We had a heavy rescue program that we instituted in the Alameda County Fire Department that was, again, a shared resource that provided heavy rescue services to the entire part of southern Alameda County. Those are a couple.
Do you have any numbers that you know in terms of savings that?
I don't off the top of my head. I can tell you the one that strikes me the most right now, when Alameda County consolidated Union City and Newark into the county fire department, the city of San Leandro saved $300,000 in overhead costs because of that happening. And the costs are going to be different, and I think what Jack mentioned earlier is it's about how you come together and how you go about doing that, where you really begin to understand what those long-term savings are.
But I think with the San Leandro Fire example, they saved $1 million the first going out of the gate. It was an engine company, so that's $1 million a year for 15 years, and then probably another $500,000 in overhead. Yeah, so $1.5 million a year for 15 years in the fire service.
I'll throw a hidden cost in there that we can save. Who likes paying lawyer bills? Anyone? Okay. Think about it from my perspective. What would I rather have as a labor negotiator? 3 clients need a labor contract negotiated, or 1? You regionalize, you're now reducing the legal overhead costs substantially. And you know what? We don't work for free. So, our clients that do the regionalization, the consolidation, they're now needing these specialized, always outsourced services. Specialized legal, specialized accounting, specialized training, all that stuff. Those costs go down substantially to the point where part of our business model is consolidation, regionalization of mandated trainings. We've got the state divvied up into different jurisdictions, and anybody that's in that part of the state can dump a little money in the pot and come to the big group training instead of doing it agency by agency by agency. So you can cut legal costs to a significant degree, and in some agencies, that's a 7 or 8 figure budgeted item each year.
Unless there's, you've got a burning question.
I'm not sure this is a question directed specifically at you, but more the audience. And thank you thank you very much. Great information. But when I look at this and how it relates to our city and our town, I get frustrated. I get frustrated on a lot of levels. One, I think our town has an inferiority complex. We tend to think we don't have the money to handle this ourselves, that we're waiting for somebody else to solve it for us, when actually the median income in our town is 10% above the country's median income level. We tend to talk about getting money from the federal government as though it's free, when if you actually look over the next 10 years, $4 billion will come out of Vallejo to pay for the federal, additional spending going on at the federal government. Whereas if we had direct control over those choices, what would we do? Okay, and then we talk about not having enough money. A few years ago, we had $25 million, your budget was what? $83 million. Today it's 60. Yet we don't work on the things in this town that are going to bring business, that are going to bring our property values up, that are going to reduce the need for public safety. Not that I'm against public safety officers, But we've got, for instance, we've got 1% of our minority males making it to and through college. They're making a rational choice to get into gangs. It's the smarter choice if that's your prospect. If we get those kids to and through college, we won't need as many officers. That's where the bulk of the crime is occurring. If we change that, then we can attract business. Rodeo and American Canyon, the property values of two cities that I think anybody who lives in this town would say are inferior and don't offer what we offer, their average property value is $75,000 more per home. You take that and we increase our property value, then we can afford to pay for this. All right. But I really think we have to think about that.
Well, and you know what? This is a great opportunity for you guys to make some closing remarks, because I think we've pretty much questioned out. I don't know if you want to jump off from where Dave left us, and if you have any closing remarks, because I think that we're sort of at that point now. Does anybody want to?
Well, no, I just appreciate the opportunity to come and speak with you. And I think, even though sometimes the discussions are painful, I think community involvement and your involvement in this is important. It's important for the community to have a sense of its direction in the longer term and to be able to address these issues. It's not always born of a positive kind of feeling. It's sometimes a necessity. But it is a necessity that can be addressed, and I've seen community after community struggle with these issues and work through them. And it's a little like making sausage. It's not a simple plan. It's not a simple direction. Pushing forward and trying is really the important thing. And over time, you'll find some of those solutions that work best for you, because there isn't one size fits all. There is no big metro system in the world that works for everybody.
I'll keep my comments brief, but I think probably the most important thing I'd like to leave you with, that whatever you do has to be a very inclusive process. It has to include organized labor, it has to include city management, it has to include elected officials, and it has to include community representation, because if you all aren't at the table together, whatever you try to do will not be successful. So I encourage you, if you're going to do something, to bring together those groups and move forward as a group to whatever solutions you find work best for your community.
And I'll just dovetail that by saying those are good thoughts. In addition, deal in objective data. Don't deal in turf battles, fear, or feelings of inferiority complexes, for example. I've never heard Vallejo described as being something that had an inferiority complex before, and I'll tell you, in labor circles, Vallejo is what everybody else wanted to be. Because, when I negotiate the labor agreement, Nevertheless, employees are comparing themselves with their peers out there in the profession. And literally, for 15 years running, almost every list I've seen in Northern California includes Vallejo, because Vallejo pays among the most. So, and I'm sure worth every penny. So deal in objective data instead of fears and turf battles, and work as a partnership, process this. It'll lead you to a solution, whatever the proper solution may be.
With that, I want to thank you so much for coming out tonight. It means a lot. And once again, free of cost, and thank you all for coming out on this program.